Hey, and welcome to another Front-End Engineering Explained. So let's see how quickly I can get through this one. So basically, what I want to look at is you have a layout like this. So you have a little radio button or check button maybe, checkbox maybe, and then you have your label, and then you have some explainer text below it. Now, you might have seen it like this, but more likely you would have seen something like this, where the help text is lined up with the label. Now, how would we do this? I mean, if we think about the HTML, and we use little boxes, let me give this a stroke and make it transparent. So if you think about this like a little box, you can imagine that's maybe like our radio input, right? This is kind of our label, and then maybe this is like paragraph text or something, right? This overshoots a little bit, but let's just ignore that for the moment. We can stretch this guy a little bit. There we go. So, but then we have this little gap here. Now, if we just think about it immediately, we can think like, okay, well, that could be just like a margin. And we can do it like that, and I'll show you that in a second, but I'll also show you why this might not be the best idea, just because it can be finicky, right? So let me show you what I mean. So if we go over here, and I'm going to uncomment this part and save it. So we're getting close, but the one thing we probably want to do is, turn off some margins and stuff on here. So I'm just going to go ahead and comment this CSS. Going to make it live, so to speak. And there we can see, there we have it. Right, so basically what I did is our container that has our input and our label, I've set that to display flakes. I gave it a little bit of a gap between our input and our label. I gave it a max inline size of max content, and then I aligned them center. The thing is, what you'll notice if I do this, for example, you see that it doesn't quite line up, right? And that is because of the little bit of margin that sits around our inputs there. But what you can also notice now is now that I turn those margins off, our paragraph isn't really playing along anymore. We have to tweak our inline start margin here a little bit. But that might be okay because we just turn our margins off, which is what we want anyway. So we're back to normal again. Thing is, what if we want to change our gap? Again, now it doesn't match. So now we kind of have to play with this a little bit. So 1.6, that's not quite it. 1.8 maybe. That's about it. But then again, when we want to change our gap to like 0.7, again, things are off, right? So let's just go back to 1 here. And then something that totally also works is if we set our direction to right to left, everything lines up. So everything's good there. But you can see how finicky it is. So could we do it differently? And that's kind of where the title from this comes from, right? So with CSS Grid, I'm just going to comment this one out. And the HTML here is a little different. So where we had our paragraph outside of our container that contains our input and our label, we here have everything right next to each other as siblings. And we have it one container called grid form field. And then I'm going to comment this out, and I'm going to bring in this. Right. So now you can see it looks super cool, as the previous one did. And of course, if we set our right to left here, everything super cool, right? But here's the benefit now. Now, if I change the gap to 1.5, everything's good. Now, remember, when you just use gap, you're setting both the column and the row gap. Right, so that's why it's going a little bonkers there. So you could do, for example, what we maybe only want now is like column gap, right? So you can see there, but now maybe it's a little wide, so you can go 1 rem. Okay, sweet. But you see, as I change these things, the thing that is always correct is that space, that little open space. So if we go back to penpot here, this little space of ours here never gets screwed up. We never have to mess with any kind of margins or anything. If we look at our field help text down here, it has a margin of 0 always. We haven't messed with that. We haven't messed with our margin. In fact, we can turn this off while our alignment over here goes off. Our alignment on our text start is still fine. But of course, we would want that off. Now, how do I achieve this? So with CSS Grid, we got a couple of things. We've got many, many things. But three other things we have is we have grid template columns, we have grid template rows, and then we have grid template areas. And normally, if you've used grid template areas before, you might be familiar with the idea of like these named areas. And then you associate the named area with some specific container or more than one container or element. And then they kind of slot into those spaces. And you kind of use this, I want to say ASCII art way of defining how your layout looks like, kind of, sort of. And so what I mean by that is, for example, if you have a label that needs to span 2 columns, you would put label, label, other element, right? And it would go then 2 columns, 1 column. But there's another thing you can do, and that's the dot that I was referring to. So if we look at our grid template area here, let me actually do it like this. You can see we have our input and our label, which means we have in our first row, we have our input and then our label, each taking up 1 column. And then on our second row, we have a dot and our help text. And then you can see here, any radio or checkbox will be slotted into our grid area input. The label will be slotted into our grid area label. Our help text is going to be slotted into our grid area help text. And then what our dot does is it's basically acting as a little placeholder or a spacer, if you will. So it's just saying nothing will go in this, but it should take up the same amount of space as whatever is above it. So in our case, it's our input element. So the space there that we're taking up will always be whatever the space is of our input. Because of course we have our grid and we have our rows and they match in sizes, right? So this, I think, is a much, much cleaner implementation that gets you the same end result. It works right to left, left to right, but it's much more predictable and much more resilient with changing of row gaps, whether that's just your row gap or your column gap or your column gap and your row gap. Doesn't matter, margins, paddings, anything like this. Things will always line up predictably. When you zoom, when you do your zooms, like, like this, everything keeps lining up. So that is something that I wanted to share. It's something that we had to do at Factorial for implementation of a form we did in the last week or so. And we implemented it like this. And I thought, like, this is really nice. And I'm sure a lot of people have run into this and might have wondered, what are the options? How can I do this? Maybe you've done it with margins and you've always found it a little finicky, like I showed, having to constantly tweak things a little bit because it's a little off here, it's a little bit off there. Maybe when you go down to mobile, you have to tweak it again a little bit because your gap is maybe smaller on mobile than it is on your larger viewport. So if you haven't used it before, give it a try. I think you will really enjoy working with this kind of layout and you will find it much more stable, much more predictable. So if you like this, give it a thumbs up. If you want more content like this, as per usual, hit the subscribe button and then go ahead and make cool stuff for the web. Keep things open, accessible, and keep the web a little weird at the same time. And until the next one, cheers, peace, and have fun. Bye.